The US and Canada have always been treated like the safe bet of global politics. Same borders, same security interest, deep supply chains and massive trade flow. For decades, investors, businesses and government assumed one thing. No matter what happens in the world, the US-Canada relationship stays stable. But this week, that assumption didn't just crack, it basically shattered. Because Donald Trump just dropped one of the most aggressive trade threats we have seen in years, a potential 100% tariff on Canadian goods. And let's be clear, this isn't a normal policy dispute, this isn't a small trade adjustment. A 100% tariff is basically a message that says we are willing to make your product twice as expensive overnight. And that's not a negotiation tactic, that's a shock wave. And the reason makes this even bigger. Trump isn't claiming Canada attacked the US, he's not saying there's a national security emergency. The trigger here is trade and especially Canada making a limited move towards easing tension with China. Canada recently negotiated a narrow agreement with China aimed at reducing pressure in a few sectors, especially things like electric vehicles and agriculture products. Important detail, Canada didn't announce a full free trade agreement. Canada's leadership publicly signaled this wasn't some alliance switch. It was pragmatic economics, but Trump's response, it was blunt and threatening. He warned that if Canada becomes what he called a drop-off port for Chinese goods trying to enter the US, punishment will follow. And this is where the story turns darker. Because now we are not just talking about tariffs, we are talking about control. Think about what the message really is. Canada is a sovereign country. It has its own economy, its own national interest, its own trade strategy. But the US president is basically asking, will you run your trade policy the way I want? Or will I financially punish you? That's not partnership, that's pressure. And this is why these movements matter so much. Because the United States and Canada are not just neighbors, they are deeply connected economically. We are talking about energy flows, manufacturing, and supply chains that don't stop at the border. Canada is a major supplier of energy and raw materials to the US, and the US is one of Canada's biggest export market. So when you introduce a 100% tariff threat into that system, you are not protecting the economy, you are injecting volatility into a machine that relies on stability. And Trump didn't stop at tariffs. He went further, pushing the narrative that China would basically destroy Canada from the inside. At one point he suggested China would eat Canada alive, destroying its business base, social fabric and way of life. Now here's what's interesting. Trump himself has previously praised the idea of negotiating with China. In the past, he's literally said if you can make a deal with China, go ahead and do it. But with Canada, the tone flipped fast, and that sudden reversals tells you everything. This isn't about pure economics, this is about who is allowed to act independently inside the Western alliance. And if you are wondering why this feels so tense, it's because it is. For years, tariffs were used as weapons against rivals. Now they are being aimed inward toward a close ally. And once you normalize that, it opens the door for something bigger. If Canada can be hit with 100% tariffs for making a limited trade move, then what happens to Europe? What happens to Mexico? What happens to any middle power that decides it doesn't want to follow Washington perfectly? That's why this is more than a Canada story. This is a signal, a warning, and it's showing the world that the Western alliance isn't operating like an alliance anymore. And here is the real question we need to ask. If the US is willing to economically threaten its closest neighbors, What does that say about the future of the global order? Because when your safest relationship becomes unstable, it means the entire system underneath it is shifting. Here's where this story goes from trade dispute to a full-blown geopolitical fracture, because the tension didn't stay in quiet meetings or private calls. It exploded publicly at one of the biggest global stages on earth, the World Economic Forums in Davos, and the timing couldn't be more symbolic. While Trump was there pushing his vision of a new global order, one based on dominance, leverage, and raw power, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped up with a message that sounded like a direct warning. He didn't even need to say Trump's name, everyone knew who it was aimed at. Carney spoke about how the old international system, the one built after World War II, is breaking down. The rules-based order, the idea that trade, diplomacy and alliance runs on shared agreements and stability. Carney basically said that era is fading, and then he dropped a quote that instantly spread everywhere. Middle powers must act together because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. That line matters because Canada is the definition of a middle power. Not a superpower like the US, not a giant like China, but still strong enough to influence trade and strategy. And Carney's point was simple. In this new world, countries like Canada can't afford to be passive. Because if they stay quiet, they'll get pushed around. Then Carney referenced an even darker idea from history. The strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. That isn't just philosophy, that's a warning. It's basically saying we are entering a world where power matters more than rules. And Davos noticed. The speech was widely praised because it didn't sound weak or apologetic. It sounded like Canada stepping up and saying we are not just going to obey, we are going to act in our own interest. But here's the thing, this is exactly the type of message Trump can't stand. Because Trump doesn't view alliance as equal partnership. He views them as leverage, and Carney challenged that worldview right in front of global elites. So what happened next? Trump fired back with a line that was loud and honestly revealing. He said Canada lives because of the United States. That statement is bigger than people realize because it implies Canada's success is not earned, it's granted. Like Canada exists only because America allows it. And Carney's response was just as direct. He said Canada doesn't live because of the US, Canada thrives because we are Canadian. And right there you could feel the relationship changing. This was no longer about tariffs on paper. This became ideological, it became personal, and then it escalated again. Trump made moves that were not just about economics, they were about status and punishment. He revoked or pulled back Carney's invitation to join his newly announced Board of Peace. Call it what you want, a board, a coalition, but the message was obvious. If you challenge me publicly, you are out. That's not diplomacy, that's loyalty politics. And if you are thinking this is just drama, there's one more detail that makes it even more alarming. Trump has repeatedly mocked Canada's sovereignty. He's referred to Canadian leaders as governors. He's floated the idea of Canada being absorbed into the US. And recently he even shared an altered map online showing territories like Canada and Greenland folded into US control. People might laugh and call it trolling, but here's the difference in 2026. It's no longer just memes, it's being backed by real policy threats. When a country gets threatened with a 100% tariff, that's not a joke. Canada makes a limited trade move with China. Trump flips from good deal to punishment. Then Davos happens. Carney warns the rules-based world is collapsing. Trump responds with dominance language. And suddenly Canada is treated less like an ally and more like a subordinate. And this is the part nobody wants to say out loud. If the US starts using economic weapons against close allies, then the entire Western system changes because the West was built on trust, predictability. But when protectionism becomes aggressive and tariffs become tools of political discipline, all of that gets replaced with fear and instability. And that instability doesn't stay in politics, it hits markets, businesses, and consumers. Because if Canada and the US start trading blows, price rise, supply chain break, investment confidence drops, and global rivals benefit from the chaos. So this isn't just Trump versus Canada, this is a real-time test of whether middle powers can stay sovereign in a world where superpowers act like empires. And the scariest part, this is happening between the US and one of its closest partner. Which means if it can happen here, it can happen anywhere.